we're going to start in the beginning.
Okay.
And it was kind of interesting that Carmen was talking last week about starting in Genesis, and he talked a lot about how we got to that point and everything. And we're not going to stay in Genesis, but we're going to start out in Genesis. And we'll start out really simply by just saying that in the beginning, God created everything.
Heaven and earth.
That was that simple. I'm not going to go into detail on that. I think that we all have a good understanding of exactly how all that worked out. So we see at the very end of Genesis 1, then God saw everything that he had made, and indeed it was very good. So the evening and the morning were the sixth day. So at this point he's done creating, and he sees that things were not just good, they were very good. There was no need for anything to be fixed at this point. Everything was perfect. Adam and Eve were there. They were in a perfect relationship with God at this point, and everything was exactly the way it should be. So everyone lived happily ever after, and that's the end of the story, right?
If it were only true.
If only.
Other 65 books will tell you.
The other 65 books and the other 49 chapters of this book. I want to jump to Jeremiah. Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. So God's plans for us humans are for us to prosper. He doesn't want us to be harmed. He doesn't want to harm us. He wants to have hope, a future. God wanted the best for Adam and Eve. He wanted their life to be absolutely perfect. That's what God wanted. At this point, God had not introduced sin. That word hadn't come into play, although we're going to use that word to describe what's about to happen. But at this point, God was in perfect harmony with Adam and Eve. Now we come, interestingly, to the very first prophecy in the Bible. Note that what God predicted here was fulfilled very literally and in detail. We see in Genesis 2:16, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, of every tree of the garden you may freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die. They had one rule, one thing that they could not do, and an infinite number of things they could do. But they had one thing they could not do. They might not have known what die even meant, because nothing had died at this point. But they knew that it was bad. It was pretty clear that it was not a good thing. Things were perfect, but we now have a description of what would make things not perfect. Not perfect was dying, separation from God. God lives. Eat of the tree and you're going to die. Separation from God. God wanted the best for Adam and Eve. Do you think this was a test? Any thoughts on that? Was God testing Adam and Eve?
Not really. Because he knew what they were going to do.
He knew the outcome. And the interesting thing, if we think of it as a test, God didn't leave them empty-handed. He literally gave them the answer key. He told them exactly what they needed to do. He didn't make it a mystery. It wasn't difficult for them to figure out. He didn't say figure it out. He told them. He said, don't eat of the tree. He told them exactly what they needed to do to stay in perfect harmony with him. The phrase, just as a note, the phrase of in the day of, that's basically, in Hebrew, that's an idiom that means for certain.
Oh.
So just so you're aware of that. So that doesn't, that they would not have understood that as meaning they're going to die that day. It would just mean that it is certain that death is going to happen. is basically what that means there. Next up, chapter 3 of Genesis. The serpent shows up on the scene to tempt Adam and Eve. So the serpent tempts Adam and Eve, and in verse 6, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree desirable to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. She also gave to her husband with her, and he ate. Then the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves coverings. Man had chosen to make things not perfect. Man had chosen to eat of the tree. Things are now not perfect. Man had, if you want to think of it as a test, man had failed the test. He had chosen something that was not best for him. God wanted what was best for man. Man had chosen something contrary to that. God was life, and man had chosen death. Separation from God. Man had sinned, and man's relationship with God had been harmed.
And they were prospering in their relationship with God.
Yeah, they had the perfect relationship.
Going back to Jeremiah.
Yeah. It was a relationship that we can't even imagine. And they were in the middle of it, and they chose to harm that relationship.
They could have everything they wanted there.
They had everything they wanted.
They just knew. It's good.
Let's spend just a little bit of time talking about God's nature. We learn throughout the Bible about the nature of God. These are absolutes. God's nature is immutable. It cannot change. It defines him. Why is it a problem that Adam and Eve ate from the tree when he told them not to? The reason is that God cannot tolerate sin. We see in Isaiah 59:2, but your iniquities have separated you from your God, and your sins have hidden his face from you, so that he will not hear. So there was a problem. God can't stand sin. This relationship needed fixed. Relationship was harmed. It needed fixed. What is the solution? If you had to guess what the solution might be, what would you say? Sacrifice. Does this sacrifice have a name? Jesus. Yeah. You guys have read ahead. I like that. Let's jump to the latter part of Luke. Jesus has come. He's gone to the cross. And we're midday on the third day after that. So in Luke 24, we see, now behold, two of them were traveling that same day to a village called Emmaus. So this is the road to Emmaus story, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they talked together of all these things which had happened. So it was, while they conversed and reasoned, that Jesus himself drew near and went with them. But their eyes were restrained, so they did not know him. And he said to them, what kind of conversation is this that you have with one another as you walk and are sad? Then the one whose name was Cleopas answered and said to him, are you the only stranger in Jerusalem? And have you not known the things which have happened there in these days? And he said to them, what things? So they said to him, the things concerning Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how the chief priests and our rulers delivered him to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we were hoping that it was he who was going to redeem Israel. Indeed, beside all this, today is the third day since these things happened. Then he said to them, O foolish ones, and slow of heart to believe in all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not the Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded to them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. Verse 27. Did you catch that?
Yes.
Jesus explained the things in the Old Testament that referred to him,
That's right. Explain to him.
beginning with Moses and the prophets. Jesus showed the men on the road to Emmaus that he was correct. He showed them his purpose. He explained himself, and he corrected their way of thinking. not all of us can be on the road to Emmaus with Jesus and have him directly expound the scriptures, starting with Moses and the prophets. That would be nice, but we don't have Jesus to do that for us directly. So let's jump into the Bible and let's see what the Bible can tell us in the Old Testament about the solution to this problem that we have, where the relationship between God and man has been harmed. Let's see if it's going to tell us anything beyond God's nature that we just mentioned, that he can't tolerate sin. What we're going to do over the next however long it takes us is we're going to go through the Bible chronologically as it was written, and we're going to see where the evidence takes us. We're going to go back to the Bible to the book known as the first book of Moses, which is, of course, Genesis. And at that point, we can see that man has sinned. The relationship between man and God has been harmed, and it needs fixed. So we're going to dive into the Old Testament, and we're going to figure out whether or not there's enough reason there to say that Jesus is the Messiah, is basically where we're headed. Questions on that? Right now, at this point in the story, with what we've talked about so far, there is literally an infinite number of possible solutions with what we've talked about in Genesis so far to this relationship problem. At this point in Genesis, we have no clue what the actual solution is going to be. Will there remain an infinite number of possible solutions?
Yeah.
No. Well, we'll whittle that down just a little bit. We already know the answer because we jumped ahead. We already saw in Luke that we know that Jesus talked about this. But we're going to see how specific the Bible can get and what it can tell us about this solution. We're going to look at locations in the Old Testament that describe the solution. We're going to see how specific that we can get. We're going to basically see if the people 2,000 years ago, when Jesus showed up, would have known what to look for, or whether it would have been tough for them to know. We're going to go into this, and we're going to see what the Old Testament tells us for this. This is something I've been thinking about doing for a long time, and I've never sat down and actually worked through it. It's possible that everyone else in here has, and if so, you can help me out and tell me what I'm missing and all that. But this is something that I've thought about doing for a long time, to see what the Old Testament actually says about the coming Messiah. I've never done that, but we're going to go through this.
Basically, where is Jesus in the Old Testament?
Where is Jesus in the Old Testament? But we're going to look at it from the standpoint of what they would have known at the time.
Okay.
There are some people that say that you can find Jesus in every book of the Bible and you can see evidence of him here and there. That's easier to do whenever you're looking backwards. Whenever you're looking backwards and you know all about Jesus, you can look back to every book in the Old Testament and you can say, oh, there's Jesus. We're not going to do it that way, though. We're going to look at it from the standpoint of what they would have known at the time, what they would have seen at the time, and we're going to look forward to see whether or not Jesus is justified as being the Messiah in their eyes.
I think too looking forward is one thing versus looking back, but we take for granted that we have the written form available, whereas
Yes.
most of the people in Jesus' day would have heard the word but not had copies.
Yeah, exactly. And they did an amazing job of verbally sharing it, but they didn't have it to look at. They didn't have it to review the way that we do. And that would have made a big difference. We're going to, a little bit later on, we're going to dive into what they would have had and what they wouldn't have had. You might want to take notes. That's up to you, obviously. We're gonna be hitting various verses throughout the Old Testament over the coming weeks. If you know of anyone that questions whether or not the solution that we believe in, Jesus, is actually the solution, they might enjoy coming. Feel free to invite. We can all learn together, and the discussion as we get more and more descriptive of what this solution is going to be should be interesting. We are not going to do every single reference in the Old Testament that might possibly be construed as pointing towards Jesus. I'll be happy to share that I've revised my study several times over the past few months as I have been writing this, because I've removed references that did not pass my sniff test. Basically, if I felt like I was jumping through too many hoops to show that something might refer to Jesus, we're not going to cover it. If you go into this study and you find things that you think should be here, by all means, bring them up. We'll talk about them together. We'll reason it out. But I do want to point out, though, that some of the things that we're going to run across in the Old Testament might seem a bit obscure, but they're directly referenced from the New Testament. The New Testament will say that this happened so that the Scriptures might be fulfilled, and things of that. So for those, we will leave those, and that's proof enough to me that they're valid references. So we'll hit some of those. The other thing is what might seem obscure to us here in 2024 might not have been obscure to them. They had different ways of looking at things, different ways of interpreting the language, and we're using English translations that are the best we have, but they would have understood some of these things a little bit differently. And so, someone that was living then might have heard one of these prophecies and said, oh, well, that's obviously a reference to whatever. Whereas to us, we look at it and we're like, that doesn't make any sense. That, it's not as obvious to us. So keep that in mind. So back to Genesis. From what we've seen so far, we know that a fix is needed to solve this broken relationship. At this point in Genesis, we have no clue, no concept of what that's going to be. At this point, not to be sacrilegious, but it might mean God snapping his fingers. It might mean him breathing in a certain way, waiting for man to just figure it out. Anything could be the solution at this point in Genesis where we're at. We simply know nothing about what could fix this relationship. We know that God wants the best for us, so we know that he wants the relationship to be fixed. We know that he's not happy with that, but we don't know exactly what it's going to look like. Kinda. We know that whatever the solution is has to be within God's nature. We know that God can't change his nature, so whatever the solution is, it's going to have to be in God's nature.
I think interesting as you talk about solutions and even what we've read already. It's like Adam and Eve, their knee-jerk reaction and solution was to sow fig leaves.
Yes. Yeah.
We thought, how did they know how to sow fig leaves? And she said, what? How do they know they were fig leaves?
Yeah.
Kirby.
Yeah, that's... Their eyes were open. Yeah.
A leaf later identified as a fig leaf.
Oh, okay.
Well, we know that Adam named all the animals and everything else, so he probably named all the plants as well. So, but yeah, that's a good point, though. Man has already tried to come up with a solution to make the relationship better. He's already tried. God saw right through that. But we need a solution that's going to work for God. And we know that he can't tolerate sin. So that one we know. That one's easy. We also know that God is love. We're told in 1 John 4:8, he who does not love does not know God, for God is love. Not God has love, not God does love, God is love. And so we know this. So God cannot be unloving. God's happy state was not to be in this harmed relationship with man. A solution was needed to put God back into this loving relationship. We also know that God is just. Deuteronomy 32:4, he is the rock. His work is perfect, for all his ways are justice. A God of truth and without injustice. Righteous and upright is he. So God cannot be unjust. It's not in his nature. Man has done something that God told him not to do. Man had committed a crime, basically. God's nature is to be just. Punishment must be meted out for this sin. Punishment has to occur because God is just. There's simply no other way. So based on God's nature, there are not an infinite number of solutions. We know that the solution will be an absolute and ultimate example and act of love. Hopefully in your mind right now, you're just thinking, man, Jesus was love. Sin had consequences, and the solution had to be extreme, basically. Not just partially just, and not just kind of an appropriate answer, but it had to be the ultimate answer to the statement that God said, where you must surely die. If God said there's going to be death, justice says that there's going to be death. And it's God, so there's going to be death. Let's jump ahead a few verses from where Adam and Eve ate from the tree. And God is talking to the serpent, which of course we know is the devil, Satan, Lucifer, whatever. God already said that the serpent will be cursed, and then he says this verse, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." I will put enmity. Enmity. Oxford Dictionary defines that as the state or feeling of being actively opposed or hostile to someone or something. I will put enmity between you and the woman. So the serpent and the woman are not going to like each other. Between your seed and her seed, he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. So basically, between your offspring and her offspring, you can kind of think of it as that. And the text then switches to talking about a he, and goes on to describe some actions that will take place. At this point, even though God in his infinite wisdom had everything under control, and the human body was built to be capable of procreation, kids had not yet been introduced, but we now know that the solution is not going to be random. We know the solution is now going to be a man from the line of Eve. So we've gone from an infinite number of possibilities in the 3rd chapter of the Bible down to the solution being a man from the line of Eve. So, now if we're looking for something, we know that it's got to be love, it's going to be an example of love, it's got to be just, so it's got to solve this death problem, and it's going to be a human man that's a descendant of Eve. We're going to see how many things we can put on a slide like this that limit what we have to look for in what the solution is going to be. We know a lot more about it now. Right now, there are about 8 billion humans alive. It's estimated that there's been about 100 billion humans so far, if you add up everyone. So we've gone from infinity down to a more manageable number. Obviously, it's still a big number, but it's not infinite. Obviously, I'm playing a little bit loose with the numbers. If we figure that there's 100 billion humans that have ever lived, that's here in 2024. If we were to think back, say, a couple thousand years, there wouldn't be nearly that many. But that gives you a sense of the scale of what we're talking about here. We're looking at what the Old Testament gives us, though, and so far we know it's going to be a human man. So if we're going to say that we have a solution, if we have a potential solution, we need a way that we can test whether or not this is the right answer. So if we're looking at something, we're saying, is this the solution? We need a way to test that. So we know something that the solution is going to do. The solution is going to majorly bruise the head of the serpent, and the serpent will minorly bruise the solution's heel. We don't really know what that means yet, but we're getting a little bit more detail about this. We know that the solution is going to cause big problems for the serpent. And the serpent is going to cause a little problem for the solution. I've written here. Now as we go through the Genesis timeline, many years and many generations pass. Adam and Eve are thrown out of the garden. They multiply. The flood happens with Noah, which teaches us a lot about God's nature. We know that he loves humanity enough to save them. And, sin clearly has consequences of death, though. The Bible then spends a lot of time talking about genealogy with a brief interlude to talk about the Tower of Babel. Note that we've already flown past Genesis 6. It's clear, though, that there were many, many families spread throughout the world at that time. We've got people spreading all over the place, hundreds, if not thousands of miles. And we're continuing on down through Genesis. And by the end of Genesis 11, the genealogical tree that we are concerned about had made its way to Abram. Abram was a special man chosen by God. And in what I'm getting ready to show, God is talking to Abram. And in Genesis 12, we have, now the Lord had said to Abram, jump to verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. End of the verse, verse 3. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. God is talking about the solution here. In Abram, the entire earth, all the people of the earth, they're going to be blessed. This blessing statement is also repeated a little bit later in Genesis in chapter 18. We're just timeline here. We're somewhere between 2100 BC and 1900 BC. So we're on the order of 2,000 years before zero. And we know what we believe is happening at zero, the solution. But we're 2,000 years before that. In you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So we're getting more specific already. We're only in Genesis 12. We no longer just have a mere male descendant from Eve, which could have been any guy living at that time. We now know that it's going to be of the line of Abram. So we're whittling it down more and more as we go. And what will the solution do? Bring blessing. Yeah, absolutely. So we know that all the families of the earth will be blessed. So whenever we're trying to test a solution, we can say, is this solution that we have here, is it blessing everyone? So that's what we're looking for. We're looking for a descendant of Abram. It's going to cause all of the earth to be blessed, basically. I hope you're starting to feel a little bit of the wonder and just the majesty of what God is orchestrating here. We're still 2,000 years before Christ, basically, and we're seeing his plan working out. Abraham, we'll call him that, Abraham then has kids. We know the solution is going to be from the line of Abraham, so we know that he had to have kids. He had Ishmael from Hagar in Genesis 16. And in Genesis 17:19, then God said, no, Sarah your wife shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant, and with his descendants after him. In Genesis 21, but God said to Abraham, do not let it be displeasing in your sight because of the lad or because of your bondwoman. Whatever Sarah has said to you, listen to her, for in Isaac your seed shall be called. So now we know that it's not just going to be any son from Abram. It's going to be an Isaac. So out of all of the various kids that Abraham might have had, God tells Abraham that Isaac will be the one. So we know that it's not just going to be from the line of Abram, it's going to be from the line of Isaac. So we're getting more and more specific. Abraham is then tested with Isaac. How's he tested? Sacrifice. Yeah, God told Abraham to sacrifice Isaac. So Abraham is tested with that. Obviously, that goes well. Isaac and Rebekah have Esau and Jacob. Jacob steals Esau's birthright, as well as Esau's firstborn blessing. Jacob runs away. Jacob has a dream at Bethel of the angels going up and down a ladder to heaven. In Genesis 28, while all that's happening, the Lord tells Jacob, also your descendants shall be as the dust of the earth. You shall spread abroad to the west and the east, to the north and the south, and in you and in your seed all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So out of all the kids that Isaac could have had, Jacob is the one. So it's not going to be of the line of Isaac, just anyhow, Isaac. We now know that it's going to be from Jacob. As you know, the line of Jacob is a little bit of a special line. Jacob had another name that we know him by, and that was Israel. Demographers estimate that if you add up all the descendants of Jacob that have ever lived up until today, you get about 100 to 150 million. So we've gone from infinity down to 100 billion-ish, give or take. Now we're down in the 100 to 150 million range. Again, this is playing very loose with the numbers, very loose. But we've gone from a lot to not nearly as many. We're Abraham's grandson, so we're still in the 2000 to 1800 BC time frame. So we're still way back there. Also known as Israel. We get the 12 sons. Then we have the Joseph story. Joseph is betrayed by his brothers. He's sold into Egypt. Famine happens. Jacob and the rest of the family move to Egypt. Jacob nears the end of his life. This takes us to Genesis 49. Jacob is approaching death, and he has a message for each of his sons. He calls them in, and one by one, he basically gives them a message or a blessing. He starts with the firstborn, Reuben, and tells Reuben that he won't excel because of what he's done in the past. He doesn't have a very good message for Simeon or Levi right after that. But then, in verse 8, he gets to Judah. Chapter 49, verse 8. Judah, you are he whom your brothers shall praise. Your hand shall be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's children, all your brothers and sisters, shall bow down before you. Verse 10, the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh comes, and to him shall be the obedience of the people. So Judah is declared to be the one that everyone else is going to praise. Siblings will bow down before him. And in verse 10, we're told some interesting things. We know that Judah is going to be the lineage of rulers. Basically, the scepter, that's what the king held. So we know that Judah is going to be where the rulers come from. Power, control, destruction of enemies, laws. All this is going to be from Judah. Until Shiloh comes. Does anyone know what Shiloh translates as?
Place of rest.
Place of rest, place of peace. Here it can refer to one who brings rest or one who brings peace. And that it will gather the people together. The ultimate giver of peace is going to come through Judah, and everyone's going to be gathered to that.
It makes you understand why the Jewish people were looking for a ruler,
Yes.
a king.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
I think you can see in the translation that we just had of that there is some interpretation taking place as they capitalize Shiloh.
Well, they capitalize Shiloh, and I was going to point it out. They also capitalize him here. And you know, one of the jokes that I commonly like to make is that anytime we see the word capitalized, we know it's talking about Jesus. We're ignoring that for this study.
Well, and actually, that goes beyond translation into
Yeah.
interpretation.
Yes, exactly. And so, if we see a him or a he that's capitalized, we're ignoring that for the next few weeks because we're going to figure this out on our own if we can. So just because him is capitalized there, I am not looking at that as automatically referring to Jesus. But we know, though, that the ultimate giver of peace, the ultimate bringer of rest, is going to come through Judah. We're now down in the range of about 10 million descendants of Judah. Again, playing very loose with the numbers. Speaking of numbers, we're now getting ready to jump from Genesis to the book of Numbers. We have Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers.
Wasn't Judah like the lead?
We're going to jump to the book of Numbers. One of the stories talked about in Numbers is our good friend Balaam. When Balaam is introduced in Numbers 22, he was at Pethor near the Euphrates River. You can see Euphrates there on the map in his native land of Mesopotamia, which is obviously over there to the east of the land of Israel. And Balak, the king of Moab, which is over here, sent for him. And Moab is the area just to the east of the Dead Sea, which is this thing down here below Jerusalem. So Moab is just to the east of that. So the king of Moab sent for Balaam. Balaam was over there in Mesopotamia. And we hopefully we remember the story of Balaam with the donkey. And then Balak, the king of Moab, tried to get Balaam to curse Israel multiple times. Each time, Balaam, who can only share the words that God is giving him, Balaam ends up blessing Israel and talking about how great they are instead of cursing, which does not make the king of Moab very happy. But we're going to pick the story up in the fourth cursing where Balaam is talking. So in Numbers 24, we have, I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob. A scepter shall rise out of Israel and batter the brow of Moab and destroy all the sons of tumult. Balaam is describing a future event here. We know that it says, I see him, but not now. This could partially be talking about David, but David doesn't do all these things that Balaam's talking about here. Balaam sees him, but not in this time and location. Balaam, by the way, we're around 1400 BC here. So we've got another 400 or 500 years past Judah. So around 1400 BC, a star is mentioned. Remember that Balaam was from an area to the east of the general area of Israel. He was from over there to the east. It's possible that in the future, from Balaam's time, that wise men from that area might pay close attention to what past prophets from the east had said. So if Balaam is talking about a star coming out of Jacob, you could imagine that wise men from the east might pay close attention to what that prophet said. The scepter we've seen mentioned has not departed from Judah, but this particular reference seems to be more about what David's going to do. But we have some special things here, though, that the people of that time would have paid close attention to. A star shall come out of Jacob. So we have another thing to look for. A star. Interestingly enough, I'll just give you a hint. This is the only reference to the star that we're going to have. But as far as pointing to what we understand to be the Messiah and everything about that, this right here is the reference for the star.
Does it say the star in Scripture, or does it say a star, just like he said?
Well, the New King James is a star. Are you convinced? If you read this, would this be enough for you? Think back to what you know about the New Testament. You have the wise men that are watching for the star. And I bring this up. I point this out. I point this out because we are going to see some things that we will look at and we'll say, I'm not sure that would have convinced me. We're each going to have to make up our own mind on this. I think we'll know where we'll land. But some of the prophecies that we're seeing here, they're important. But it's not going to make you automatically say, oh, I'm going to watch for a star. Thoughts on that?
We're not that wise.
We're not that wise. Yeah. And like I said earlier, the people of that time would have looked at these words differently than we do.
They navigated by the stars.
That's
They
right.
Absolutely.
have no clue
They
what's
do.
going on.
Yeah.
out there.
Exactly.
But they also read stars too, like to give them in certain areas.
Yeah.
They read them as future.
Yeah. Having astrological type significance.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. We are just getting started, but we're out of time today. We're going to get into some really amazing stuff.